so excited to be here. I feel like all of my nutrition information and facts comes from your podcast. I've even written you about, I think you should teach like an online course because you're so informative and the book really has been an awesome example of how you approach nutrition and fitness in the three pillars. I love that. And also being a physiotherapist do you go by scientific nutritionist or just nutritionist?
I think these days more nutrition scientist because I'm spending more and more time actually being involved in research and study design and less time clinically working one-on-one. Although I still sort of wear that hat of clinical nutrition with certain people, and then through the podcast, I guess I'm just approaching my conversations as someone with great curiosity about science in general. So I'm not sure if there's a title for that other than podcast host.
Awesome. Do you feel like you get a lot of that sort of the way you approach things? And you can tell all our listeners a little bit about how you went down this path with your dad, because your dad was a PhD and you kind of grew up like understanding and seeing that example. You want to tell us
Mm.
a little bit about that, your background?
Yeah, sure. I think my dad modeled to me the importance of being curious and asking questions and being objective and being excited about learning and updating your positions, which today I think is being lost on people. It seems like people are really quickly jumping to having deep convictions and wanting to be absolute and certain on topics to kind of appear as an expert, when in reality, the greatest experts out there have an appreciation for the uncertainty that exists. And that's essentially a part of the scientific method. I grew up in a household where we would sit around at dinner and science would be spoken about, the method, what it is, the tool, details that I think are only really appreciated if you have someone modeling that or a scientist in your family, or you go and study it and formally, and you don't have to do that at a university. There's a lot of resources outside of university that can help people appreciate what science is and maybe what it isn't. And in that, you get great clarity uh, about the way that the world works. And in this case, for me, my passion was the way that human body works and the way that nutrition interacts with our physiology and how that affects our health today and our risk of disease in the future, and ultimately how much we can squeeze out of our life, how much enjoyment we can get if you kind of break it down really simply. When I was growing up, I had this kind of seed, a very important moment that set me on this path, kind of inspired me to make a career out of this. I was with my dad, and I'll tell you the short story, and you can let me know if you want to double click on anything. But I was with him. He had a heart attack. It was just the two of us together.
He was
Uh,
really young, right, at the time?
right. So he was 41. So very young. And I would say, and I've said this before, representative of a young Australian father. So he wasn't someone that was, morbidly obese or super overweight or on medications for blood pressure or cholesterol. He would go to the gym a few times a week. He played squash. We didn't eat a super ultra processed diet. We ate a lot of whole foods, but there certainly was a lot of animal fat in the diet that we grew up on and that my dad consumed. And so this heart attack essentially came out of nowhere. Someone that's not on medications and doesn't have a diagnosis who's 41, you're not really expecting them to all of a sudden, be in cardiac arrest. And so we were very remote, and they sent a helicopter and took him to the nearest hospital, and fortunately were able to stabilize him. And in the kind of aftermath of that, you have, a family meeting with cardiologists usually, and they give you a debrief as to prognosis of your family member and what they've been through and what their future looks like. And then they'll also speak to the family a little bit about, genetic risk and if you should be screened for anything. And my brother and I were in that meeting, and I was 15, my brother was 18, and it was made clear to us that cardiovascular disease runs in families, which is true. It does. Uh, People who have a family member or parent that's had cardiovascular disease are at higher risk. Uh, and the conversation kind of ended there. And for a long time, I felt like that burden, that risk that my brother and I had inherited being the key word, was a genetic, predisposition. And there are some genetic predispositions that do carry a high risk for cardiovascular disease, but they are rare and far and few between. They're not what is accounting for the majority of cardiovascular disease. The reason that cardiovascular disease, and I went on to learn this some 10 plus years later, is running in families is mostly because families are adopting the same lifestyles. So
Right. Just repeating it.
right. So you can be, if you don't dig into the data and you ask the question, well, why is this disease running in families? Is it because a certain gene or a genetic signature is being passed through, and therefore that's out of your control or mostly out of your control? Or is it because the parents are modeling certain behaviors that are being passed through to the children, and that those behaviors are increasing risk of disease, X, Y, Z, or whatever it is. And
And those behaviors are that you're speaking about are what's in our diet, a lot of it, and our lifestyle. Yeah.
yeah, so what foods we are eating or we aren't, what exercise we're doing or not, uh, the stress that we're carrying or we're getting rid of, attenuating, the sleep we're getting or we're not getting, both quality and duration, whether we're smoking or not, like all of these things that people have heard about, they stack up and can really incrementally increase your risk of developing a disease like cardiovascular disease, where you end up having usually atherosclerosis, which is just a confusing, long, fancy way of saying a blockage in an artery that's ends up restricting blood flow, usually to the heart tissue or to the brain is when it's most serious, and someone will have uh, angina if it's early on, and that's chest pain, or they can have a cardiac event, like a proper cardiac event, like a heart attack, like my dad had, or a stroke. Uh, so it was learning that I had a lot more control over my future health that kind of flipped a switch, and I went down this path, monomaniacally focusing on the science and learning as much as I could to make the best decisions that I could to pass them on to my family, and then ultimately I felt compelled to kind of communicate it to a wider audience, like you said, through a book and through the podcast.
Yes. I mean, it's all of the podcasts that I listen to so many of your podcasts, and especially a lot of the ones with Rich Roll, where you really dive deep into the science and nutrition and the facts. And I think because you do it in a way that doesn't seem self-serving or bias, and even in your book with the three pillars, I get where you are trying to get people to understand, right? Nutrition personally is of course, everybody's choice. But how do we help people to understand that it's not just about our bodies, it also is about our earth, and we share
Mm.
that collectively. So how do we get people to understand that it is definitely stressing out the planet. The climate change is something I feel like that doesn't connect to nutrition as much as it should. It's like a newer,
Mm.
which is why we're doing the podcast, right? Like, how do we make that connection too? Like, I'm not trying to, I think, like you are, just take meat off
Yeah.
of everybody's plate, but just to have eyes open on these facts that are not
Hmm.
what our opinions are. It's just what is scientific proof that what's going on in our climate.
Yeah, that's it. That's a very big question. And if there was a simple answer for that, then we wouldn't be having this conversation. But I mean, let's zoom right back out. And some of this, I think, is is made clearer when we understand what our values are and morals, what we care about in life. So I think the individual taking the time to get clear on that is a very important step and often something that's just completely overlooked. I personally, and I think most people share this view of the world and life, and you think about, what is the purpose of life? Like, what are we doing here? What are we trying to achieve? I think one of the most important things to me is to leave people that I interact with and planet nature better than I found it. And that's
100%.
that's just a basic life philosophy or mantra that I follow. And that's not just something that is benefiting the external world around me. It's actually self-serving, and there's a degree of selfishness to that, which I think is can be a good thing. We know that when you serve people, planet, anything, something external to you, you actually feel better. Your life, your quality of life improves. So at a very, very fundamental level, if someone's optimizing for their personal quality of life, then serving the people in your community, all of the relationships you have, the planet, that's in your best interests. So I think like people sitting with that and uh understanding that this is not just uh some sort of uh what's the word I'm looking for here? Virtue signaling. I think often we can fall into this trap of it can come across as virtue signaling. Like, look at me, look at the way I'm living my life. It's better for the planet, and I don't think that resonates with people that you're wanting to make a positive impact on. So I would kind of flip the narrative on that and just ask people what matters to them in their life, and hopefully then they feel compelled to protect the planet, to protect animals, because they love the planet, they love animals, and you want to protect the things that you love. Um, so again, as I said at the outset, this is not a simple solution and requires a lot of depth of thinking from an individual. And I do think it's a thing that as you mature um, and get a little older, you often have not really more time, but you have more to reflect on, and you ask some of these bigger questions. Who do I want to be? What do I stand for? And it's just a part of growing up, and um, the more people who can do that, who can then model it to their kids. I mean, ultimately, that's how we're going to change the world. Um, but you're right. In the book, I separated nutrition from animal welfare and from planetary health because I think they are each of them are very important conversations in their own right, and then they can come together and be an overall conversation. And that's where I make my thesis in the book is, I think there are a number of different ways to eat to be healthy. And you can have some animal foods in that diet. There's no debating that. If I was to take the position you can't have animal foods in your diet and be healthy, I would be destroyed in a scientific argument. So I think that would be like a fairly silly argument for me or position for me to take. But a position that I think is very strong is if you're optimizing for your personal health, you're optimizing for the planet, Earth, biodiversity, greenhouse gas emissions, ocean acidification, you're optimizing for animal welfare, then there's a very, very compelling case to say, okay, I am going to eat as plant exclusive as possible. Okay. So that could depend on personal circumstances. It's definitely going to depend on where someone lives in the world and food access. It would be unfair right now to suggest someone in a third world country who has access to very reduced number of plants and animal protein is serving an important role from a nutrient point of view, be unfair to say that that person should just eat wheat, the only crop that they have available. But for people who live in Western populations who have access to a wide variety of foods, if you care about the planet, if you care about animal welfare, these things are important to you. My philosophy is to downshift on animal foods as much as you can and find a dietary pattern that leaves you feeling really healthy and good as well, that you can sustain over decades, and it's not just a kind of 4-week challenge.
Right. So do when people that you come in contact with on a daily basis, are they always asking you the same question, like, where do you get your protein? How are you as an athlete able to sustain more on a plant-based diet? Because these are the questions that I get every day as a health coach. Um,
Mm,
and I get it, right? It's an important question, but it's still like, aren't we there yet? Like, can't we? People understand that plants have protein, and like, how do
mm.
we answer that question without sounding sort of like we are boastful, or we
Sure.
have more information. I do, you do. Yes, we have more information on the nutrition side, but how do we approach it in a way that would maybe motivate someone to
Right.
maybe dip their toe more in the plant-based without coming
Mm.
across as, in a negative way?
Sure. I think the first thing is acknowledging that those questions are really valid. And I understand where those questions come from. Like if you think about the conditioning that we have, if you think about uh, the marketing that we've been exposed to, particularly as children, you think about, groupthink is real when collectively a large percentage of people believe something to be true, even if it's not. It's very, very hard to change that across society. So, and I was there myself personally. There was a time when I believed animal protein was absolutely king and far superior to plant protein. My views on that have changed over the years. And how do we answer that? I think the way we answer that question is first with empathy, in that that question's valid. And I get that question every single day. It would be very easy for me to get frustrated and think, how many studies do we need? How many times do I have to talk about this? But each person's a different individual. They're on a different journey. They didn't see that podcast 6 months ago or hear about that study. Uh, they've grown up in this family where it was on a farm and all they ate was chicken and beef. And so the people are complex and they're individuals. I would say what I would reassure them is that progressively over the years, this is a topic we've learned more and more about. And I've refined my thinking on what optimal kind of protein intake looks like. And we've also seen large shifts in the protein researchers, the scientists, so the domain specific experts who are studying protein metabolism. They're studying muscle growth, hypertrophy, strength, these outcomes that are typically important when we think about protein intake. And we've seen across the board changes in their views and evolution. And that's not to be confused with science being confused or science being flawed. That is the nature of science. Ideas evolve over time. People change their views, and they can, so if they can support that by data, then that's actually a sign of a good scientist. If I was to break this down, I'd break this down into three kind of key points. Number one, the amount of protein that you consume per day matters more than the distribution. It used to be thought that, do you have to perfectly split your protein up to 5 meals a day or 4 meals a day, and that's going to result in greater improvements in muscle strength and hypertrophy. If that does make a difference, it's insignificant. It's very, very, very small and not important for the everyday person. If you're an Olympian and you're looking for every single last little bit of advantage you can get, maybe.
Right.
So amount. So how much? Well, I think that there are different views on this out uh, in the nutrition sphere still to this day. Um, I think the best recommendation is between 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram. And so that's going to be a little higher than you might see from some certain vegan doctors. And that's going to be a little lower than you might see from people in the bodybuilding world. And uh, so how do I come to that recommendation? Well, at at that 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram, that's where
What does that in
you,
pounds?
that's a good question. We would have to, I'm not really good at converting that on the spot. But roughly let's say
We'll get back to that.
let's say someone weighs 70 kilograms. Again, I should be doing this in pounds for you. Remember, I'm from Australia.
Yes, I know.
But if someone weighs 70 kilograms, then that's around, 100 100 to 105, 110 grams of protein per day. Okay. And the evidence shows that that level of protein intake is optimal from a muscle strength and hypertrophy point of view when combined with resistance training. And that's really, really important. 90% of the population are not doing resistance training. If you don't have the stimulus there, so moving your body against some form of resistance, which could be your body weight, could be a band, it could be in the gym. If the stimulus is not there, the body is not going to adapt. It's not going to use those amino acids, which are the building blocks of protein, to just build more muscle tissue. That's not
Right.
what
With no
happens.
stimulus. Right.
You have to have the stimulus. Structure reflects function. So number one, top of this kind of pyramid is making sure that the stimulus is there in the first place, which means at least 2 resistance training sessions per week that go for about 45 minutes to an hour long. And when you're in that 1.2 grams to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of your body mass, that's when you are optimally supporting that stimulus to get those strength and muscle growth gains. And why is that important? This is not just a vanity thing. As we age, we're getting age-related loss of muscle tissue and strength, and uh, that that's a big risk factor for sarcopenia, which is essentially loss of muscle quality and size as you age, and therefore frailty, risk of falls. So optimizing the protein amount is important. I don't think the arguments of that protein restriction are better for longevity are very strong. Those are mostly built upon animal research, and those animals are in cages. They're not subject to the rigors of everyday life like you and I are. So sure, you can protein restrict an animal and it might live a little longer, but how would that animal go out in the wild, and having to navigate obstacles and to feel vital? So I think optimizing protein is important there. So that's amount more than distribution. Point two, the source, where you're getting your protein from, matters. And this is where some people will make the argument, oh, animal protein's better for those outcomes I just mentioned, like hypertrophy, which is muscle growth, or strength. And you know what? They're right if you're not consuming enough protein. But as soon as you
Right.
get to that level that I just stated there, 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram, there's no evidence that animal protein is superior. And in fact, there's multiple studies now that have looked at this, and you don't see a difference in strength or hypertrophy. Both groups develop equal strength gains, equal growth of muscle, regardless of whether that protein is coming exclusively from plants or it's coming from a mix of animal and plants, like in an omnivorous diet. So we can kind of bust that myth that animal protein is better for building muscle, because that only really matters in the context of a very protein restricted diet.
Right.
Okay. So if you're getting 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram and you're eating just a modest kind of variety of foods, so I'm thinking you'd be adding in foods like tofu and tempeh and all the different types of beans and chickpeas and even like TVP, which some people might say is very processed, but not all processed foods are equal. TVP is very high in protein and very high in fiber and can be a really good addition to increase protein or plant-based protein in meals. The advantage of getting more of that daily protein from plants, and the average person in America right now gets 75% of their daily protein from animal sources. The advantage of changing that and getting more of that from plants is the long-term benefit that you get. And so when you are reducing foods like red meat and chicken, and instead you're eating those foods that I just mentioned, there are a number of things that happen typically when we look at risk factors. So you'll see improvements in blood pressure, you see improvements in blood glucose control, you see improvements in blood lipids, importantly, reduced ApoB, which is the best predictor of atherosclerosis, what I was talking about before. Um, you can see improvements in inflammation. And so these important risk factors for cardiovascular disease, for type 2 diabetes, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, for dementia, these are shifting in a more favorable direction. So now you're consuming a diet that is supporting the workouts you're doing, but it's also supporting your physiology to make sure you're healthy into your 50s, 60s, and 70s, and hopefully avoiding these chronic diseases that so many people are being affected by. And people are being affected by often not just one, two, you know, comorbidities, which is having a huge effect on their quality of life. So number one, amount more than distribution. Number two, the source. And then number three, and this kind of, as I just mentioned there, automatically comes when you eat more plant protein, is that there there is an argument to be made that when you're consuming protein at a meal, to also be consuming a good amount of fiber. And this is particularly important if someone's trying to manage their body weight, whether maybe they're trying to lose some body fat. And, we all know when you want to lose weight, it's tough. You're hungry. So we want to be able to manipulate the diet in a way that makes it as easy as possible. One
Of
of the
course.
really, really cool kind of things that has come through research in recent years, that I only learned about very recently, I think is helpful for people, is that protein is very satiating, but it's made more satiating if you slow down its absorption.
Right.
If the protein that you consume is slowed down such that more of it makes it to like the distal or end part of the small intestine, it actually stimulates more production of these hormones that regulate appetite. So how do you slow down protein digestion? Pair it with fiber.
Fiber.
So if you're making those swaps that I mentioned, automatically your fiber is going to be going up. But in addition to that, I would be thinking about at meals trying to get quite a good amount of fruits or vegetables, starchy vegetables, these high fiber foods in your meals, particularly if you're trying to lose weight, and you'll feel fuller after that meal.
Yeah,
Um,
for longer.
right. So that's kind of my long but hopefully direct way of answering that question.
Can you touch a little bit on one specific food category that I have this another is along with protein every day? I hear a lot of pushback on getting dairy out of your diet. And as much information as I know from my own studies, I want to hear your what you know about nutrition because I hear from studying this that actual calcium milk and dairy actually does the opposite of making our bones stronger. It actually is it leaching out the calcium from our bones? Is that true or is that a myth?
I think that's a myth.
Okay.
It was once thought that the calcium in dairy was through pH balance, causing protein to be leached out of, sorry, calcium, protein to be leached out of bones and causing increasing risk of osteoporosis. That has been fairly thoroughly debunked. I think there are numerous studies showing where the addition of dairy foods with exercise interventions was able to increase bone mineral density. Um, so yeah, I wouldn't say that dairy is increasing risk of osteoporosis at all. Um, I think overall the evidence on dairy is a little bit mixed, and it probably depends on what someone is eating instead of it, and
Right.
also what type of dairy. So if you have dairy in your diet, which is a source of protein and calcium, it's also sometimes it's fermented, and you remove that, and it lowers your protein intake and calcium intake to a less than optimal level. Say, for example, you remove it and you consume lots of white bread or refined grains instead, then that might be a move south, a negative move for someone. If you take out a food like milk and swap it for a plant-based milk that's equal in protein and calcium, then that might be a sideways shift. It might actually be a beneficial shift. There are some studies showing swapping cow's milk for soy milk, and you see benefits in lipid profile. Um, and then
Is that because
if
the
you,
isoflavone?
yeah, probably because of the isoflavones, um, and some of the fat profile in there, some of the unsaturated fats that are in soy milk are probably slightly more beneficial than the odd chain fatty acids that are in dairy foods. Then if you look at like just dairy foods overall and cardiometabolic outcomes, this is where it gets really confusing quickly. Uh, the type of dairy matters a lot. So butter, almost always associates with increased risk of cardiovascular disease, and it's probably because of how processed butter is. There's a compound in dairy foods, a milk fat globule, uh, which affects the way that the fat in that dairy food is absorbed and affects your cholesterol. And so when you refine the dairy down into butter, you break the milk fat globule down, and the saturated fats now in butter are having quite a significant effect on your blood cholesterol, increasing blood cholesterol. You don't see that effect so much when you look at particularly fermented dairy, so yogurt and certain cheeses. These foods seem to be neutral or sometimes positive. And I think the sometimes positive again comes back to what are people eating instead. So dairy is one of these foods where I think the results are a little mixed. The context matters, could feature within a healthy diet, is is one of the uh, probably most damaging foods when it comes to the environment, and certainly one of the least kind of humane aspects of animal agriculture. So I think there's a few other things to kind of consider there, but it's dairy is not poison, which sometimes you'll see online.
When people talk to you about being an athlete, which you are and have been, and you've worked with athletes, I'm sure people ask you every day, so what are you eating? Like, what's a typical day in Simon Hill's diet look like?
Okay, so this morning I had a smoothie, and that smoothie. So I worked out this morning. I did strength training, and then after that, I had a smoothie that had banana, oats, berries, a couple of Brazil nuts in there. I usually throw those in.
Selenium.
Uh, yeah, I use a plant-based milk called Ripple. No
Hmm.
affiliation with them. I think it's made in Canada. I live in Los Angeles now, so I can get it here. Uh, why do I choose that? Because it has 300 milligrams of calcium, or like 400 milligrams of calcium per serve, and about 8 or 10 grams of protein. So it is comparable to cow's milk. What else did I put in that? Put protein powder in there as well. So I had it about 20 or 25 grams of protein powder into that. And then, whatever's in the fridge. So I'll grab, like, I think I grabbed arugula or rocket, we call it in Australia. I grabbed some of those greens and threw that in today. Some ice. There's a big smoothie to kind of start the day. If I'm snacking, it's almost always fruit or nuts. And so mandarins, I love the seedless mandarins. I can eat those all day. Apples, bananas, avocado, almonds, pistachios. They might not sound that exciting, but over time, I think you begin to look forward to them more and more when you go through changes to your diet. Lunch, this will, almost always I'm doing quite simple things, Aaron. I will have, quinoa or brown rice. I have an air fryer that I love to use to very quickly cook like tofu or tempeh. So chop it all up. I get an avocado or like an olive oil spray, and I just very lightly spray it in that. And I do that mostly because it makes it a little crispy, but also when I just throw on like spices, so cayenne pepper and black pepper and a little bit of salt, it sticks to the tofu or tempeh nicely. I put it in, I let that air fry for like 15, 20 minutes. And it's a really important thing for people who are trying these foods for the first time. Remember, they're a vehicle for flavor. Just like
Yeah.
chicken doesn't really taste like much if you were to not do anything to it. Um, some people have challenged me on that, but I don't think chicken, from my memory, tastes like much. Uh, you got to add your favorite flavors to it, and that's cool
Yeah.
because you can make it taste like Thai food or Japanese or Mexican, whatever variation you want to go with. Um, so I'll have that kind of air frying away while I'm preparing everything else, and then I'm just like chop up some greens. I'll have some other veggies in there. I really love frozen vegetables, and for a few reasons. One is I find I waste way less food. So when I go to the markets and I do buy fresh food, sure, but I buy less than I used to because I was finding that I wasn't eating some of it quick enough and it would spoil. So I buy a little less at the markets, and then I get frozen like broccolini and carrots and peas. And for someone like me that's trying to keep it simple and quick, you just take those out, put them in like a glass container. You add just a tiny, like 3 or 4 tablespoons of water, cover that up, put it in the microwave, and in 5, 6 minutes, those are ready. I like simple, quick things. So the air fryer's on, that's happening. Where now we're just like plating up, and I'll usually drizzle, either some lemon or lime or something over the top, and then hot sauce, sriracha or whatever other hot sauce I have on hand. Maybe add some jalapenos. I like it spicy, and that's like a lunch, and that will end up having like 40 grams of protein easily, probably more when you add up everything because there's protein in other foods in there other than just the tofu or tempeh. Then I'll go through and maybe I'll have some sort of snack in the afternoon. And then I'll make dinner. And usually my dinner will follow a similar method to what I just described, but I will vary
Right.
it up. So it's like different variations, so I'm not getting bored of it. And lately I've been finding all of these like really tasty sprouts at the local market. So like the last few nights I've just been dumping like a huge handful of like radish sprouts, or I found these sprouts that taste like wasabi. And I think that's actually another fun thing, is just going down to the markets and like picking and choosing different things that you've never tried before. um just makes your dinner's a little bit more exciting.
And diversity, right? The more diverse our plant life is in our nutrition, obviously the better, right? You've talked about that for the gut microbiome health. To feed ourselves in diversity across the board in plant food is really great because, as you're about to tell me, it's great for gut health, correct?
Yeah, and I think that's often one of the most helpful things for people to kind of hear and understand. And it really can change your perspective on how you eat. In that, when you are eating, you're not just eating for you. There are 38 trillion microbes living inside of you, and that is a symbiotic relationship. And by definition, that means that them living there, residing there, and that being their home is beneficial to them, but it's also beneficial to you. But how beneficial it is to you really depends on the food you're eating or not eating, and essentially how well you're feeding them. So when you're eating for two, you and them. And what food do they love? Well, they, as an umbrella term, we call it prebiotics. So probiotics people have heard of, those are like the live organisms. You can go into a supplement store and you can buy a probiotic capsule, lactobacillus something. That's a live
Right.
organism. That is the bacteria. A prebiotic is not a live bacteria or a dead bacteria. It is food that bacteria eat, put simply. And there are three broad classes of prebiotics in our food. There are dietary fiber. So certain types of fiber act as prebiotics, resistant starch, and polyphenols. And all three of these are found in plant foods. And plant foods contain different types of dietary fiber, different types of polyphenols, different types of resistant starch, each of which feed different species of bacteria. So the aim of the game here is you're trying to have a really diverse, rich microbiome, which means you want to be making sure that you're feeding all of these different species that exist within you. And the best way of doing that, as you said, is to have variety through your diet. And there was a big study done by Rob Knight, the Microbiome Gut Health Project, which was looking at 10,000 subjects who sent in samples of their poop, and
Mhm.
they analyzed them because poop acts as a window into your microbiome. You can see the bacteria.
Right.
You can understand what bacteria are in that person's gut. And they also were interviewing, surveying these people, and finding out, a general idea of how they eat, so you can understand their dietary pattern. And it wasn't whether that person was an omnivore, a pescatarian, or a vegan that best predicted microbiome diversity. What predicted microbiome diversity most was the number of unique plants in their diet. And so the people who had 30 or more unique plants in their diet per week, not per day, sometimes people think that's per day, and that's really hard. 30 unique plants per week compared to those who had 10 or fewer, which I've found in speaking to people, go and check this next week. Don't try and increase your plants. Most people fall between 10 and 12, somewhere in there. Uh, these people with 30 or more had much more diverse microbiomes, which is associated with better health outcomes. So that's like a very simple kind of heuristic framework for people. It's just go away, see how many unique plants you're eating this week. Uh, it's maybe it's 10, maybe it's 15, and then slowly but
And that can
incrementally.
include spices too, different nuts, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. So what does that include? So it includes fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds, whole grains, legumes, herbs and spices, and sprouts. I want to throw sprouts in there. My friend Doug Evans always reminds me to make sure I add that. Um, and that's just a very nice, simple framework to focus on and almost gamify. And I can guarantee what happens. What happens is you go from 12 to 30. Well, something has to give. You have to remove something from your diet, right? Because you're going to be full. So what's coming out? It's probably the red meat. It's probably processed meats. It's probably some ultra processed foods. And so in doing that, you're going to shift to a dietary pattern that by default is better for all those risk factors we mentioned before. and also better for the planet. So like that can often be just like a very simple, one takeaway from a conversation that can be very impactful.
Add more of these foods, take more away of the processed meats and the fatty foods. So when
Hmm.
people talk to you back to the protein, can you tell us, and this is something I learned from you about when we eat protein, our body can't tag it and say, oh, this is superior because it's chicken, fish, red meat, turkey, blah, blah, blah. How does that work in our bodies? Because I think people don't understand that simple
Mm. Yeah,
fact.
that came from a conversation that I had with a friend who was just kept asking me question after question after question. And I realized if I can't explain this simply, then I just don't know this well enough. So the tagging kind of concept was the simplest way I could explain this was that in food, so let's say it's chicken or tofu, both of these foods contain protein. Protein is made up of amino acids. Okay. There are 11 non essential amino acids. Your body makes those. There are 9 essential amino acids. You have to get them from food. Okay. All plants contain all 9 essential amino acids. Let's clear that up. They're all in there. It was a myth that they were ever missing. They're not missing, they're just in different ratios. When you consume tofu and when you consume chicken, that goes in through the stomach, into the small intestine, and the protein that's in those foods is not just absorbed as protein. We break it down first into amino acids. Okay, so it gets broken down into all these different amino acids, and then the amino acids get absorbed into circulation into our blood. Okay, and so some of these amino acids that are essential are like valine and leucine or
Right.
isoleucine. These are some of the ones, the branched chain amino acids that people may have heard of. Okay, we don't need to list them all out because I just want to explain a kind of principle here or physiology 101. So you've consumed the chicken, you've consumed the tofu, goes into your stomach, broken down into amino acids. Now leucine, let's take leucine for example. Leucine enters circulation. At that stage, leucine is flowing around in your blood. It's not tagged as leucine from chicken or leucine from shrimp or leucine from beef, and leucine from beef somehow just magically goes to muscle tissue and results in muscle, but leucine from tofu doesn't. The body has no way of knowing where that leucine came from. Leucine is leucine. Um, so that can be a kind of a helpful thing for people to think about because it is a little counterintuitive because I understand that people might think, well, if you eat muscle from an animal, then that's going to be better at growing your own muscle. I can sort of understand that kind of logic, but that's not exactly the way that it works.
Good, because that is the topic of conversation like every day. And I want
Hmm.
to be able to answer that more informative. And, as an athlete myself too, often talk about to my patients and my clients that there's also less inflammation. And that's important in your recovery as an athlete or of a person who is just
Hmm.
working out, right? Less inflammation in our body is going to make life and our health a lot better. But I don't think people always understand that inflammation comes from food, that it can come from food. Can you
Hmm.
dispel that a little bit?
There's certainly, I mean, there's not a huge amount of evidence looking at this because inflammation is so poorly defined. We use a global marker like HSCRP, but in reality, there's a couple hundred or more inflammatory proteins, inflammatory biomarkers. But generally, there's what's called a pro-inflammatory index that people can look up, and you see that diets that are higher in red meat and processed meats, but also ultra processed foods, those are higher on the pro-inflammatory index. Whereas diets that are rich in fruits and vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts and seeds, whole plant foods, and fatty fish is within that. Those tend to be more anti-inflammatory dietary patterns. Um, this I don't think we know exactly yet, and I would love to know this, how this plays out in sport. Anecdotally, you see a lot of athletes, particularly towards the end of their career, shifting to more plant-based diets, and they say that their recovery is better. Um, I'm yet to see a group of scientists study that directly and kind of see what is the difference in inflammation and how does that benefit performance. So I don't know that we have conclusive information to go off, but if I was to kind of just speculate right now, I'd say one of the advantages of having less inflammation is that, again, structure reflects function. And as an athlete, you're constantly trying to put the body under stress to get it to adapt. And so one of the most important things is training volume. And so if you're less inflamed and recovering better, and therefore you can train more and get more volume in, then theoretically, overall your performance and when you get to game day or race day could be better. So um, I'm speculating a little bit there, but overall you do see that dietary patterns that are more plant-based, score much better on that inflammatory index.
And then more gains in the gym if you are, right? Because if you're able to recover quicker and better, then you're going into the gym your next
Hmm.
workout a little stronger, a little feeling a little bit better.
Yeah, I mean, anytime you can get more volume in, so whether that's by doing more training sessions because you're recovering better, or if you have less pain, then you might be able to actually lift more weight, do more reps in that session, which is increasing volume. Okay, so I think that there's a fair hypothesis there to say that as you shift to a more plant-based dietary pattern, it affects inflammation. How much, I'm not sure, and how much it affects performance, I'm not sure. But um, I certainly think that if it's neutral or positive. It's not a negative shift when it comes to inflammation when you're reducing animal foods and eating more plant foods.
How
Actually, the
often do
one
you
the
work
one
out?
caveat the one caveat that I would just add in there is that there is actually a study where uh, researchers increased fiber from 20 grams a day to 40, and in this particular study, they were comparing that to fermented foods, but that's kind of a story for another day. But in that study, some people, as they increased from 20 to 40 grams of fiber, had increased inflammation. And
Really?
you'll hear this. You'll hear people say, oh, "Hey, I tried to increase plant foods and I didn't feel great. It didn't work for me." And I think this study is quite informative. They went back and looked at the microbiome diversity of these subjects because they were collecting poo as well. And what they found was that those who had good microbiome diversity at the beginning of the study, they could tolerate the increase in fiber. They didn't have an increase in inflammation. The people who had very poor baseline diversity, so maybe they've been eating an ultra processed food diet for 20 years, starving their microbiome. Maybe they've been taking lots of antibiotics throughout their life. All of these things that we know that can damage the microbiome. They struggled. And so we walk away from that study knowing that at least acutely sometimes ramping up fiber, I think, too quickly can irritate people. And so I think the way to sort of uh, increase the plant diversity we spoke about before and increase fiber for most people is to kind of go slow and allow the microbiome time to adapt. Just like if you were to go into the gym and you haven't been training for a year and all of a sudden you went in and did the heaviest, hardest, chest workout, you could be sore for a couple of weeks and you're not going to want to train. And
Right.
and and so what we don't want is you to have high fiber for a couple of days, be sore and say, well, that's not for me. So you go in and you kind of just progressively overload and increase fiber over weeks to months rather than trying to make that big shift in a kind of matter of days.
Like low and slow, right?
Yeah.
Low and slow. How many days a week are you working out?
I work out pretty much every day, something. Resistance training, I'll do 4 or 5 days a week. And on the other days, at the moment, I've been playing a lot of pickleball. I go for a run. I'm not a serious runner. I'll kind of just go out and do, between 4 and 6 miles, particularly on a day where if I have a really busy schedule recording work, I don't have enough time to get into the gym. I'll often just go and do that run so that I'm moving my body in some way. Um, but yeah, pickleball, wake surfing. When I'm over in Bali, I play padel, which is kind of like a variation of pickleball. I'm going surfing next month in Mexico, so kind of a mix of like set structured workouts and then kind of play.
That's awesome. And do you find that like on days when you've gone heavy and you are a little bit more sore from your workout that you still work out sore?
I will usually still work out, but if I'm sore, say my legs are sore from training, then the next day is probably going to be some type of more upper body focused workout or core, plus some type of less intense cardio. So that could be when I throw in like a zone 2 cardio session where I'm just at 60-70% of my max heart rate and kind of cruising, but still getting a cardiovascular workout, as opposed to having really, really sore legs and going back into the gym to train them, or going and playing pickleball kind of thing. So I just listen to my body. It's when I on any particular day, I think the way that I structure it across the week, I'm never that sore that I can't do anything. There's always something that I can do. I can work out, okay, is today a day to do zone 2 and upper body, or is today a day to train my legs, or is today a day to do some high intensity sprint work? And I think when you kind of just spread that across a week, it's pretty manageable, particularly for someone like me. I'm not training Aaron to be
Do
a
you
kind of
run? I
an
lived in LA
ultra
for six
athlete.
years.
Sorry.
When when I lived in LA for 6 years, and I that was my favorite thing to do was run those fire roads like up into Panga. And do you ever get out there to run?
Yeah, I do. I get out there, probably not as much as I would like to. I'm based down more towards Venice, so a lot of it's along the boardwalk, which makes for interesting people watching.
For sure. For sure. Do you ever do any of the hikes in the mountains there?
Yeah, I love doing the hikes, up through Topanga and uh what's that gosh, I'm trying to think of the name. Um it's slipping my mind. There's one park kind of off the back of Pacific Palisades that we do quite
Yes.
regularly.
Is that the one that has that like had the house there and it burnt
Yes,
down?
it's got
Yes.
the house, and I think there's like a pony club or a horse club kind of down near the bottom.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that
Yeah.
hike.
Hmm.
So pretty back there.
Yeah,
So
it
do you
is.
have any I'm gonna pivot a little bit here. Any dad jokes for us today? Yeah, I know you're a big fan of dad jokes.
Okay. Uh what did the policeman say to his belly button? Sir,
Say it again.
what did the policeman say to his belly button?
What did the policeman do? I have no idea.
He said, "Sir, you're under arrest."
What's with you and the dad jokes?
I don't know. I just like to get people giggling and uh, get a reaction out of people, and I find it funny when people tell me how bad the joke was, and they're laughing. Yeah.
I appreciate that about you. And I love some of your little your isms. Like one of the ones that is coming up right now is more black beans, less jelly beans. Like I think that's so like simple but like poignant, right?
Yeah, I wrote that in the book, and then that kind of stuck. And I wrote that out of frustration in that people were, trying to demonize carbohydrates across the board, not appreciating that carbohydrates are not all equal or not all created equal. And I was in a debate last week with a guy, a doctor from America actually, who's proponent of a carnivore style diet. And his whole argument was cardiometabolic disease can be blamed on one thing. And that's actually a really important thing learning for the listener. When anyone tries to blame one thing for everything, massive red flags. Red flags should be going off everywhere.
Right.
His position was that sugar is to blame for all disease. And I clarified and said, well, what do you mean by sugar? And he's like, well, your body doesn't know the difference, when it's a whole grain or quinoa, or it's coming from a legume, or if it's coming from white table sugar. And I agreed with him in that at some final destination point, glucose is glucose. But the food that you're getting the carbohydrates from will greatly affect how that carbohydrate is absorbed, the speed at which it hits your blood. Those foods also contain different nutrients, whether they have fiber or plant protein or vitamins and minerals. And I used that example of, is a jelly bean equivalent to uh, a black bean? And we kind of went back and forth. And his view it was, yes, it is. And I said, okay, so you're blaming uh, whole unrefined sources of carbohydrates like legumes and whole grains and starchy vegetables for poor cardiometabolic health. I just want to get clear on that. And he was like, yes. And I said, well, do you realize you're blaming foods that people are not eating? So
Right.
95% of the American public are not eating those foods that you're blaming. So how can they be responsible for the poor cardiometabolic disease that we see? And I kind of went on to explain that like 70% of the American diet is ultra processed, calories coming from ultra processed foods. And so his whole thesis, which frustrated me, was that science is wrong, the recommendations are wrong, and they've caused disease. But what I was trying to explain to him, and I digress here, but I kind of want to get this off my chest. So thanks for letting me indulging here. Uh, my point that I was trying to make was the science is not confused. The recommendations that have broadly been given to population uh, are are not to blame. The problem is that people cannot follow them, and that's not to blame the individual. It's to blame the food environment and the marketing that we're exposed to, the living conditions, the socioeconomic disparity, the food deserts, all of these things are to blame because this is not a case of needing to know more. It's just that being able to do the things that we already know. And that comes down to that's an implementation problem. It's not a science problem. So um yeah, that's a kind of quick insight into that debate for you. But that all started with the jelly bean, black bean comparison.
Love it. What do you think about fasting?
I think it's a tool that can work very well for people. Again, coming back earlier, I mentioned that many people have a goal of losing weight, and if you look at statistics, kind of 70% of the population is overweight or obese, and that is a huge risk factor for most of these diseases we're talking about. And when you are going on this journey of trying to lose weight, you want it to feel as easy as possible. If you're constantly fighting hunger, you will ultimately lose that battle. And we see that in studies. Long-term weight loss through dietary interventions is not great. Um, there are different strategies to manipulate a diet to lose weight. One of those strategies is calorie counting. That can work purely from a mathematical um, perspective. It works. I find it doesn't work for a lot of people long term, but there's a certain kind of personality where that level of control works well. So you can restrict calories by counting them. You can just reduce the hours in which you're eating food across the day. So some people might be familiar, with intermittent fasting. That's often called. And I think there was a real popular phase where people were doing that from 12 midday to 8 p.m., like an 8 hour eating window. Think, if that's working for you and you're finding that's a good way to kind of reduce your calorie intake and helping you manage your body weight, that's amazing. I think there is some research to suggest that maybe a better window is an 8 hour window that starts earlier. So getting a little more of those calories in earlier in the day when your body's more active, your metabolism is working better than sort of right before bed. So, maybe an eating window like 10 a.m. to 6 p.m., something like
Right.
that. Um, so you can restrict calories by counting them. You can shorten your eating window, um, or you can shift your dietary pattern to something like a plant-based dietary pattern, or you'll see people do keto. You can do keto plant-based as well, which is like low carb. So you can, uh, or you could do a combination of these. You could say, I'm going to eat plant-based, whole, minimally processed foods, and I'm going to do intermittent fasting. And maybe that's the combination that works best for you. I think ultimately, what that looks like at an individual level will be a little bit different for different people. And that's kind of what you see online. Like you see a lot of fighting. Someone says, I did intermittent fasting and I lost all this weight. And then the next person says, that's BS. It didn't work for me. Someone says, I calorie counted, it worked. The next person says it was horrible. Um, we're individuals. I think it's just nice to know that there are like different options and you can kind of pick and choose. Yeah.
Right. What works best for your lifestyle? You know,
Hmm.
what's doable. I think some people get caught up in the patients and clients that I've worked with over the years. A lot of them with the calorie counting, it became a negative thing because they were all thinking about food all the time. How many calories does this have? And
Hmm.
I was like, this is taking away the joy of most of what you're eating. Like you're too
Hmm.
hyper focused on how many calories it has as opposed to, wow, this really tastes good. So a lot of them, we did try the intermittent fasting and they did like it better. It allowed them to enjoy their food more without having to count the
Hmm.
calories. So I think, again, it works for some people and not others. Um, are you studying anything right now? Are you producing any papers right now of that we can be privy to? Are you releasing another book maybe or anything?
My publisher would like me to write another book. That was a labor of love. Uh, I might write another one. I'm really enjoying my quote unquote work-life balance at the moment. Um, trying to get better at surfing, and I'm going to be skydiving next month, learning how to solo jump. So uh, there's a few kind of things outside of work that I want to tick off, but um, I will write another book at some point. I'm not feeling called to write at this moment. I am involved in some research. We're about to publish a paper that's looking at dietary patterns and mood, mental health. And this is really more of it's kind of a, we used a population data set in Australia um, to try and answer some questions that we have. But really, the purpose of this paper is to hopefully be able to get funding to set up a prospective cohort study that's evaluating dietary patterns and mental health over time. A lot of the research looking at dietary patterns and risk of say depression or anxiety is cross-sectional, and so that means like at one time point, and that becomes very difficult to work out the nature of that relationship. Was it that the way that they're eating caused or is associated with depression, or did the depression come first and then they changed their diet? So when you can set up a cohort and monitor the way they're eating, their mood over time, and you can see changes in diet, changes in mood over time, you can maybe begin to better understand the relationship between the foods that we're eating and mental health. So um, hopefully that's published in the next month or so, and then it's the beginning of like a much bigger project.
Awesome. And tell us a little bit before I let you go about the proof. That's your baby, that's your podcast.
Hmm.
It's you have some amazing guests on there. I was listening to uh one this morning and it's always nice that you have a guest that's like a doctor or of 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 a of an empowerment position, right? Where they have the knowledge base. Because I feel like, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, most doctors, at least here in the United States, their understanding of nutrition and having that in school or in their residency is so minimal. It's like something like 4 hours. And it's amazing to me
Hmm.
that these are the people that are helping us to feel better. But I feel like it's so much more of just a band-aid, right? Like, where is the preventative side? Where is the nutrition knowledge to help prevent some of these things? So are we making that shift? And is that a lot of your podcast platform?
I know a lot of my listeners are medical students and doctors. Get a lot of comments and emails from those guys. Um, but I think you're right. I think the kind of I think doctors sometimes it's a little unfair when we say they know nothing about nutrition. I think they know more than the average person. But I would say that the way the system is set up, it makes it very difficult for them to be able to impact their patients in a real meaningful way when it comes to changing nutrition. Like, in such short amount of time with people, it's difficult. So, I think firstly we ask a lot of doctors, and uh, there are registered dietitians and nutritionists for a reason. And so I would like to see a healthcare model that understands the strengths and weaknesses of specific professionals and is able to provide a bit more kind of rounded or holistic care to patients so that they have time with their primary practitioner, but then also have access to a dietitian, uh, nutritionist whose whole training was devoted to understanding how to eat well for good health. Um, my passion
Right.
is to get the nutrition scientists on, so the guys and the women that are involved in the actual research and are seeing what's happening in cohort studies and in randomized clinical controlled trials and trying to get that information, which is sometimes a little arm's length away in journals, peer-reviewed journals. It's arm's length away from the listeners of my show, but it's really important information. So I like to get those people on and then find out what we can learn from them. B, you can search the proof with Simon Hill. You can find it on YouTube. You can find it on Apple or Spotify. I think episode 318 was completely dedicated to protein. It was a solo episode that I did on a new study out of Harvard, and covered some of the things that we covered today, but also some other stuff. So that could be a good place for people to start that want to learn more.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your time. Can I
Oh,
have
you're
you on
welcome.
again?
Yeah, thank you. I'd love to. I love what you're doing. I don't do a lot of interviews these days, um, but I saw what you guys are up to, and I think it's a really important mission that you're on. So I'm really grateful to be here. One other thing that I should just quickly mention before I leave is sometimes I think when people are wanting to kind of just get started with making changes to their lifestyle, it can feel a little daunting. And I mentioned before the 30 unique plant kind of challenge as being a nice way to to get started. I also created a challenge last year called the Living Proof Challenge. And you can go to theproof.com/living proof. And this is zero cost. You can just put your email in, you can download a PDF, and there's an entire framework in there. So uh, Robin Sharma was a guest on my show, and he said, clarity breeds mastery. Clarity breeds mastery. And so with this living proof challenge, I was really trying to get clear on what it is we're trying to achieve. So the challenge is it's for people like me who I want to get into my 70s and 80s and just be in good health and not have chronic disease like I mentioned before. And so how do we reverse engineer that and say, okay, well, what do I have to do to get there? Okay, well, I need to protect my arteries, I need to protect my liver, really important for metabolic health. I need to protect my musculoskeletal system. Okay, well, what can we measure that are like windows into those things? And so this challenge is built around optimizing long-term health by testing key indicators of biomarkers of longevity and then intervening. And that goes over like a 12-week program, but it's very slow and gradual progressions. And then after the 12 weeks, you retest and you can see that how these important indicators that are a window into the health of your artery, your liver, musculoskeletal system, and risk of disease, how they have changed. And I found in engaging with people that are doing this, by measuring something and then seeing it progress, that can be tremendously empowering and kind of keep people on track. So if someone's looking for just like a place to start, then um, I recommend going and downloading that PDF.
Great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate your time and
You're welcome.
insight. Yeah, this is
Thank
a
you so much for having
podcast.
me.
Yeah, this is a podcast that my mom and I actually created because as a vegan, plant-based person, nutritionist, athlete, um, health coach, um, trainer, and then my mom, who I got both my parents to become vegan after a health scare many years ago. She heard about the connection between climate change and animal agriculture. So she wanted to come from it that side, whereas I come from more
Mm.
come more from the nutrition side. So it's sort of our collective baby together. So we really appreciate the fact that you came on. You're such an inspiration to me personally, but to so many others. And I hope to have you back.
Thank you, Aaron. This was great. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Talk soon. Thank you so much.